Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone in the room, and good morning, everyone online as well. Welcome to the Parliament of Australia, and a special welcome from the Parliamentary Library to our final public lecture of the year on the very interesting and entertaining former Prime Minister, Billy Hughes. This is one of the Prime Ministers we're featuring in the First State project here at the Australian Parliament. The First State project, as you will be unsurprised to hear, relates to the First State Prime Ministers. We are publishing monographs for each of the First State Prime Ministers and public lectures as well, and we're very fortunate to also have the first, actually 16 Prime Ministers captured in print form by the fabulous artist Alison Alder, who's joining us here in the room today as well. This project has been running, the First State project has been running since about 2018, and we're about halfway through our Prime Ministers. And I'll put in a plug, early in the new year we'll be launching the Joseph Cook monograph, otherwise known as the Cookbook, which we are very fortunate to have had involved from the beginning of this project, and will continue, the delightful academic historian, raconteur, Dr. David Headon, a good friend of the Parliamentary Library and a good personal friend as well. David has been involved in history and political history for quite some time. I've worked with him across the course of about 20 years, I think. And of course, David was involved in the Centenary of Canberra deeply as the official historian, in fact, for the Centenary of Canberra back in 2013. David is a great storyteller and a great researcher, a great academic, and he really does bring to life the times, the careers and the lifetimes of our former Prime Ministers, the First Eight. So without any further ado, I'd like to thank the Australian Studies Institute at the Australian National University, of which Dave is the Foundation Fellow, but without their support we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do or host these events and in fact have access to Dr. David Headon. So without further ado, Dr. David Headon.
Thanks, Stephen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, their elders past, present and emerging. Straight into it. On more than one occasion during this series over the years, I've referred to the fact that the first 7 Prime Ministers, not the first 8, but the first 7, were all members of the inaugural Commonwealth Parliament, the highly talented, if lawyer-heavy, Federation Parliament. Billy Hughes stands out for several reasons. Without doubt, he was the most controversial of the first 7 Prime Ministers and arguably the most divisive of any of the 31 Australian Prime Ministers in the 124 years since the Federation. And he has had, as we know in this room, some stiff competition. Hughes is also the subject of the largest number of biographical studies. For historian Geoffrey Bolton, he continues to defy definition. And for Hughes' contemporary, the journalist Frank Brown, who wrote a lively account published 7 years before Hughes died in old age, Frank Brown said, "There never will be another quite like him." And put exactly like that, it is hard even today to disagree. When an expert committee advising the Australian Bicentennial Authority in the 1980s compiled a list of the 200 Australians who had made significant contributions to the nation's history, in the first round, when a draft list was compiled, Billy Hughes had to be put to one side. Just as he had throughout his long life, he split down the middle the opinions of the group. And why was this? What was it about Hughes that singled him out as a figure of such intense disputation? Where do you start? I'll tackle these questions today, the best I can do, in 3 ways. Firstly, with an overview of the historical reception to try and grasp the nettle that was Billy Hughes over an extraordinary life and a turbulent political career that saw him break ranks with his political party, in 1916, 1929, 1936, 1944 and 1952, the year he died. Indeed, when Robert Menzies delivered a speech on the occasion of Hughes' 90th birthday in 1952, with him in the audience, and only a matter of weeks before he died, he paid tribute to Billy's long political life, during which Menzies noted he had adorned every political party in the Parliament. Well, this drew an instant reaction from Headon. I'm sure some of us in the audience would remember him, leader of the Country Party, now the Nationals, who piped up proudly, "Not the Country Party." Well, never one to be upstage, Hughes at 90 snapped back, "No, Artie, I had to draw the line somewhere." Secondly, this morning I'll provide an account of Hughes' tumultuous life, making sure to separate the fact from the fiction, the many tall tales told by Hughes in his creative accounts of major events in his life. And thirdly, with his life sketched, I'll say a little bit more about a few of Hughes' memorable moments in Parliament, his milestones, foibles, conflicts within his family, quotable quotes and curiosities, many of them drawn straight out of a Ripley's Believe It or Not almanac. I'll conclude with a ledger, setting his most significant achievements up against his most damaging failures. The abundance of commentary on Billy Hughes during his lifetime and after is, as you might guess, deeply divided. How could it be otherwise when in his 67 years in Australia, he was described by his admirers as charming and witty? He could be. Bright, well-read, a resilient fighter, a pocket dynamo, while critics were apt to label him cantankerous, hateful, a mountebank, a truculent jester, a charlatan full of brag, bluster and blunder, the storm bird of Australian politics. No one could advise him, and one of those who failed in this task, fellow politician William Holman, close to Hughes for most of his life, maintained that Billy's pledged word was useless and that he did not know the meaning of the word loyalty. Hughes was known to cheat at cards, golf, tennis and any activity that produced a winner. His great-granddaughter was told within the family that great-granddad Billy had been a safecracker. Hughes' main biographers agree that his version of the first 22 years of his life in England and Wales before he migrated to Australia and the first 5 years in Australia can't be trusted. And add to that the further challenge of the 33 metres of Hughes material in the National Library down the road that we know was painstakingly, mischievously edited by Hughes to present his life and legacy in the best possible light. In the words of another insightful biographer, the collection had been subjected to conscious weeding, purposeful selectivity. Ironically, in the preface to one of his two creative and highly readable memoirs, Hughes issued this guidance for historians of the future. If we wish to know whether men and institutions of today, he writes, are overshadowed by those of 50 years ago, we must peer through the mist and fog of the years and try to see things as they really were, and not as poets, idealists and sceptics would have us believe they were. Laurie Fitzharding's comprehensive two-volume biography of Hughes remains the standard work. Yet, as he informs us, it is a political biography. He allocates a bare 11 of 1,000 pages in 2 volumes to Hughes' first 22 years, recognising that in those few pages he was in effect the prisoner of Hughes' colourful memories. Fitzharding is confident that in his account the public face of Billy Hughes is fully documented, but cautions that the inner man can only be inferred. 2 important and contrasting additions to Hughes' scholarship were published in the early 1980s. The Great Professional, written by Malcolm Booker, and Donald Horne's iconoclastic volume entitled The Little Digger, and a couple of other titles as well. Booker, a retired career diplomat and for a short period in the early 1940s, one of Hughes' 100-odd private secretaries, as his title states, felt that Hughes was the complete professional, a nation-maker of shrewd intelligence, an individual blessed with the gift of genuine leadership. Donald Horne, on the other hand, in his portrait, forensically exposes Hughes' failings in a searing indictment of the 7th Prime Minister's character and leadership. Donald assesses the Labor Party's description of Hughes as its blackest fallen angel, an individual who inflicted extensive damage on the party and on Australia. He, Donald Horne, predicts that this view of Hughes will eventually supersede the persistent legend of the nation's sustainer, imperial patriot and folk hero. Hughes, he is sure, will ultimately be judged for a brand of leadership based on propaganda, punishment and a language of hatred. Shortly after Hughes died, celebrated Great War historian Charles Bean wrote that, in his words, he was wise never to write his own life, adding, "I only hope that he will get from Australian historians the treatment which his self-denial deserves." You won't hear the term self-denial applied to Hughes anymore. For Bean, that treatment would find a place for Hughes in the pantheon of distinguished world leaders. Billy would have wholeheartedly agreed with him, certain that he was the central figure in what he called the Labor Party's golden age from 1890 to 1914, and that the reason he left the party in 1916, or rather as he put it a few times, when the party left him, was because he had embarked on what he called God's mission. So what do we conclude from the scholarly literature? Was Billy Hughes the embodiment, as one Sydney Morning Herald journalist wrote when he resigned as PM in 1923, the embodiment, but more of that in a moment, was he the embodiment of the whole of our national aspirations, or was he a wrecker who left behind a trail of, as one person put it, scorched earth? Was he a maker, a breaker, or a compacted version of both? Billy Hughes was born in Pimlico, London on the 25th of September 1862, not 1864, the year he chose for himself in adulthood. He was the son of William Hughes, a well-speaking carpenter from North Wales, who spent long periods working at the Houses of Parliament. A confirmed Tory voter, he was also a deacon in what was called a particular Baptist church when in London. Hughes' mother, Jane Morris, English-speaking and Anglican, was the daughter of a Montgomeryshire farmer. Raised near the English border, she spent some time in service in London and was 37 when she married. Billy was the couple's only child. Jane Hughes died when Billy was 7, forever remembered with fondness by her son. Fortunately for young bright Billy, because of his father's work commitments in distant London, he was then raised by his extended family. On both sides, they were warm, loving and welcoming. He spent years until he was 12 with one aunt, his father's sister, on the Welsh coast at Llandudno, where he attended school, while holidays took him to the Morris farm not far away. The influence of the women in his early life was powerful. One historian suggesting that he was, quote, the spoilt motherless son coddled by overindulgent relatives. We know he was precocious, confident and sharp, an energetic youngster lucky enough to be exposed to a spectacularly beautiful seaside, which my wife and I have seen, and she's in the audience, I know, somewhere, and rural environment as his childhood playground. Aged 12, Billy was relocated to join his father and began attending St Stephen's School in Westminster, in the heart of London. Endowed in 1847 by Baroness Burdett Coutts, a renowned philanthropist, St Stephen's had earned a fine reputation and Billy thrived. A former schoolmate recalled him as a speedy runner and a notable marbles player, but inside the classroom he impressed as well, so much so that having completed prize-winning elementary studies, at age 15 he stayed on for 5 more years as a pupil teacher. He was less than 5 feet tall. When he started teaching, it must have been a disconcerting experience, instructing pupils barely younger than yourself and pretty much all of them bigger than you as well. Once again, fortune smiled on young Billy. He came to the attention of one of Her Majesty's school inspectors, and not just any inspector. Those of you who've done BAs back in the day in our sandstone universities will know this name. This was Matthew Arnold, son of Thomas, famous headmaster of Rugby School. Matthew Arnold was destined to outshine his father as social commentator, cultural critic and English poet of renown. Hughes once recalled that working under Arnold, I think that's putting it fairly loosely, was the chiefest privilege of my life. Arnold put him on the road, as he put it, inspiring in Hughes a passion for English literature and the King James Bible. For the rest of his life, Billy could readily quote both at length. In his final years at St Stephen's, he was also a proud volunteer in a battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, an experience that gave him a taste for discipline and the military mindset, set to loom large for him and his adopted country in later life. The several years from his late teens until Hughes migrated to Australia, aged 22 in 1884, remain something of a mystery. What prompted the decision and why did he decide to give up on a career in education, not brilliant, but still there, or a related activity, we don't know. And we don't have much more concrete information about his first years in Australia. Hughes' recollections in old age were clearly intended either to infuse his early life with Australian legend qualities, Billy as the bushman, Billy as soldier in the making, Billy on the wallaby as jack of all trades, or else they embellished him with folk qualities he simply did not possess. What he did have to deal with was a problematic partial deafness from his childhood days, an affliction he refused to let hold him back from any situation or any challenge. After spending time in the Queensland outback, he ended up in Sydney in 1886 with little money and lucky to get affordable digs in an inner-city guest house, which led to a relationship with the landlady's daughter, not unlike Andrew Fisher. Her name was Elizabeth Cutts. Billy failed to marry Elizabeth. They had 6 children together, and theirs was never a close relationship. She wanted it, but not Billy, and it appears to have been her modest savings that enabled the couple to buy a small mixed business shop in Balmain, where he did, amongst other things, mend umbrellas. The humble Balmain shopfront soon took on a far more important role, for it was there that Hughes established a meeting place for young working-class social activists, reformers, sold a range of political pamphlets and books, read and absorbed some of the era's globally important radical tracts, treatises and novels. He became a devotee of the American single taxer Henry George, made his first political speeches on Balmain street corners, gained invaluable experience debating issues in the shop's backroom free-for-alls, and of most significance, he was one of the first members of the Balmain Labor Electoral League, the LEL, forerunner of the Australian Labor Party. And all of this in a mere handful of years. Hughes did not present himself as a candidate for the 1891 New South Wales colonial election, but both he and, you'd say, Australia's third Prime Minister in waiting, Chris Watson, worked in their separate ways with such skill and energy for the Labor candidates that when they presented themselves in the next 1894 election, both won Assembly seats comfortably. So too did the leader of the Free Trade Party, George Reid, who I've talked about here a couple of years ago. George Reid, who became the colony's premier. Arguably the country's most astute politician of the era, Reid did not have the numbers to get a program of reform, courtesy of his minister father, through the Legislative Assembly. He needed the LEL, that is to say the Labor's votes, and the productive partnership that ensued between him and the Labor cohort was the catalyst for several years of unprecedented progressive legislation in New South Wales and a raft of bills written into the law, a success rate for legislation to that point unparalleled in the colony's history. Hughes paid close attention. He learned on the job, quickly becoming a student of parliamentary procedures and tactics, and in time the LEL's most feared weapon on the floor of the House. Hughes' oratory, a blend of persuasive delivery, entertaining touches, targeted invective and propaganda, attracted admirers across the political divide. When Billy got up to speak in the Assembly, the word went around the building and the gallery quickly filled to capacity. He had tangible proof of the power of the spoken word, its hypnotic effect on a crowd. More than any of his Labor colleagues, by 1898 Hughes had become uncomfortable with his party's relationship with Reid, a feeling that the Free Trade Premier's commitment to progressive legislation had waned, and he's right. In a series of calculated moves, Hughes and his allies were able to remove Reid as Premier and install William Lyne, a Liberal protectionist who offered Labor more. It was Hughes' first major tactical victory in politics and he liked it. He got a taste for it. His electioneering became more purposeful, more implacably result-oriented, and he was so easily elected and re-elected in the seat of Lang in Western Sydney around the docks that the move in 1901 to federal politics for the seat of West Sydney was a no-brainer for someone whose aspirations, fueled by success, had become more ambitious. He wanted to lead the infant ALP in the Commonwealth Parliament, but ironically, it was his own achievements that temporarily made this impossible. In the 2 years before the Federation, he had established himself as the popular and successful leader of two unions, the Wharf Labourers and the Trolley, Drayman and Carters. He revelled in the robust clashes with employers, the power he individually wielded. And when the vote to elect the first Labor Party leader took place in Melbourne, Hughes was absent, having opted for pressing union business in Sydney. His unionists loved him. The up yours swagger, combative language, the way he demanded equality at the bargaining table, and he delivered for them. In the early Federation years, Hughes juggled federal responsibilities with a number of union negotiations, and somehow he managed, at the same time, and usually on the Sydney-Melbourne train or the Melbourne-Sydney train, to study the law, qualifying at the bar in November 1903. With so much going on for him, Hughes' profile in the Labor Party, of course, increased. Belief and political nous had him settling on three issues that, in the first Federation decade, confirmed a continent-wide reputation for him. They were race, defence and immigration. The new nation galvanised between Hughes, amongst others, strident assertion that Australia must be white, no colour allowed, and maintained that way by a citizen force and rigorous migration laws. When Labor's first national government under Chris Watson had its 113 days in power in 1904, Hughes reluctantly said no to Watson's request that he become Attorney-General, feeling, correctly, that he was not yet ready for it. He agreed to external affairs, and while conscious that he and his colleagues were ill-prepared for the experience of government, typically he approached it, in his phrase, with exhilaration and a spirit of high adventure. Crucially for the Labor Party's future prospects, Hughes, Chris Watson and Queensland ex-coal miner Andrew Fisher all added another important ingredient to their evolving political education. In 1907, an exhausted Chris Watson retired as ALP leader, replaced by Andrew Fisher, and in the following year, Labor began the first of three Fisher governments, the party set to be in power for a little over 5 of the next 7 years to 1915. Throughout, Hughes was Fisher's activist Attorney-General and peerless aggressor on the floor of the House. The only break on Hughes' ambition was the one inescapable fact that during these exciting years of Labor in office, the ALP caucus consistently supported Fisher as leader over him, which I'm dealing with in some greater detail in the monograph writing presently. Forced to conceal his frustration, Hughes bided his time. It has been suggested that he stalked Fisher, and there is evidence for the validity of the accusation during the 12 months of Fisher's third and last term, the first year of the Great War. So that in October 1915, Fisher in desperation offered Hughes the post of High Commissioner in London. Hughes refused point blank. Fisher, profoundly depressed by the horrors of the war, the terrible loss of Australian lives at Gallipoli, and worn down by a war-energised Hughes, then makes a snap, ill-considered decision to take the London post himself. Billy Hughes, obvious successor to the job he had long coveted, thus begins 7.5 years as Prime Minister, 1915 to 1923, of 3 different parties during the most volatile and emotional period in the nation's history. For most of his prime ministership, Hughes experienced few obstructions and limitations. He stopped at nothing to increase his power, his authority, driven by the heady elixir of popular support and electoral ascendancy through a win-the-war approach and a sinister capacity to offer up to the Australian public a succession of scapegoats. victims on the home front, people accused as traitors because they opposed the war, some of them literally tarred and feathered for their perceived disloyalty in a disturbing atmosphere of uncontrolled jingoism. Hughes boasted that in his years as Prime Minister, it was his fountain pen that dictated government policy and its implementation, and in truth, he wasn't that far off the mark. The zenith of his popularity was reached in 1919 when his staunch defence of Australian interests at the Versailles Peace Conference gained widespread publicity in Australia, especially when he locked horns, great story there, with the American President Wilson as the representative, in his words, of Australia's 60,000 dead. He was indisputably the soldiers' champion, and they crowned him with the nickname the Little Digger, an appellation that took hold. And yet, even in the years of his highest popularity, Hughes generated equally intense hatred as a result of his extreme tactics. His trade unions expelled him, the wider labour movement disowned him, and for the rest of his political career he was forced to shift to different electorates to stay in the Parliament. From the docks of Sydney as early as 1917 to Bendigo in Victoria, and 5 years later a scuttle back into New South Wales, to the electoral safety of the city's middle-class northern suburbs. And even then, much later, he shifted one more time for survival. Hughes' prime ministership ended abruptly in February 1923 when the Country Party's eccentric yet canny leader, Earl Page, declared his party would no longer entertain a coalition that had Billy Hughes as its leader. Billy was eclipsed, said one droll political commentator, but certainly not extinguished. Hughes never forgot or forgave what he considered an act of bastardry, and while it took him 6 years, he eventually got his revenge on the individual who replaced him, aloof nationalist Stanley Melbourne Bruce, who, when he lost the 1929 election, also experienced the humiliation of losing his own seat, something that just more recently happened to John Howard. That makes two. For his remaining 23 years in Parliament, Hughes was, in the phrase of one newspaper, a rogue elephant, whose proven capacity to inflict harm could never be underestimated, either by his opponents or, for that matter, his party colleagues. He became something of a pariah, yet always ready and eager to accept any government position offered him, whatever the party that happened to be in office. The sad saga of his family relationships ground on until his death. Did he die contented, reflective or lonely? Did his flaws in the end outweigh his achievements? To answer these questions, I'll focus on some of the most revealing details of his life, relating to his combative politics, literary bent, complex and contradictory character, and vigorously contested legendary qualities. A better understanding of Hughes is aided by a look at what he was reading in his formative years. As mentioned, Matthew Arnold inspired in him a keen and lifelong interest in English literature and the Bible, but there is absolutely no doubt that his social and political antennae came alive in the crucible of the late 1880s and 1890s in Australia, when he was exposed to a number of writers and texts which reshaped his life and imagination and determined his chosen career path. In adulthood, Billy declared no interest in the narrow Calvinism of his father's particular Baptist church, stating, quote, "When I was old enough to think for myself, I turned from that terrible creed. I believed that as a man sowed, so shall he reap, and that by faith and good works he might find salvation. I believed that a man ought to be the captain of his own soul." I imagine that came from Walt Whitman. Based in Sydney in the later 1880s, Billy began his own search for writers who had something to say to him, those with guidance for the dedicated pilgrim determined to work towards a better world. Initially, he gravitated to the American Henry George and his internationally best-selling volume, Progress and Poverty, that came out, I've talked about it before, in 1879. Henry George maintained that society would be completely changed, made more equal by government imposition of a single tax on unused property. Like so many working-class Australians, Hughes joined one of the mushrooming single tax branches, and this brought him into the orbit of some of the colony's most prominent Labor leaders. When Henry George visited Australia in 1890 for an East Coast lecture tour, he was feted wherever he went, huge audiences. Two young men whom he inspired were a Lithgow coal miner, Joseph Cook, and a Balmain shopkeeper, Billy Hughes, though both of them soon moved on from Georgist ideas. In search of more practical answers to what Hughes referred to as the complexities of the modern world, he joined the Socialist League, establishing a branch in Balmain. Sydney's most politically sophisticated location at the time, the suburb was a hotbed of radical discussion. It was only appropriate that the very first Labor Electoral League branch, the ALP as I said in germination, was also established in Balmain in 1891. The Balmain Socialists, like other League members from across Sydney, regularly attended gatherings at iconic Lee House in Castlereagh Street. As Hughes remembered it in his florid prose, the yeast of the new order was stirring mightily through the ranks of the masses, surging forward under the banner of Labor. They saw the vision splendid. The discussion list at any given meeting might be any one or all of Charles Darwin, Spencer, Kant, Marx, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, John Ruskin, Henry George, and another American, Edward Bellamy's utopian novel, Looking Backward. That's only to mention a few. It was an exhilarating apprenticeship for all those involved. Men who toiled for a new and secular religion, a set of beliefs capable of underpinning what they imagined as a heaven on earth. Swept up in this surging tide, Hughes' own writings in two short-lived newspapers, the Single-Tax Democrat in 1891 and 3 years later, The New Order. An early issue of the Democrat contains Hughes' earliest known political writing, not brilliant, a prolix effort outlining his socialist principles, which were, for a short time, in alignment with Marxist doctrine. Between the two New South Wales elections earlier referred to, 1891 and 1894, Hughes volunteered to go bush for the Labor cause. He trekked remote country New South Wales to spruik the case for membership of the LEL, the Labor Electoral League, probably covering more terrain than anyone else, as much as 5,000 kilometres on a bicycle, borrowed horse or on foot, and eventually writing amusingly about his adventures. He warmed to what he experienced as a spirit of mateship among country people, and he wrote about that in the New Order newspaper, founded by a migrant English socialist, A.G. Ewan. Ewan sold or mortgaged everything he possessed to run the paper, with Hughes actively encouraging him. But it went bust after 17 issues, about the time, in fact, that Hughes was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. Their relationship, Ewan and Hughes, soured dramatically, so much so that forever after, whenever Ewan happened to walk past Hughes in Sydney streets, remember Sydney was a lot smaller then, he stopped him and in stentorian voice proclaimed, "Hughes, you rat." It was a foretaste of Billy's future. Sometime during his first stint in the New South Wales Parliament, Hughes stopped referring to himself as a socialist, as he and a tight group of Labor solidarities, as they were called, bound by adherence to party membership decisions, formulated policies based on agreed Labor values and principles. Hughes regarded himself as the brains of the party, but many Labor movement people remained unconvinced by his questionable tactics, hasty actions, and in particular his tendency to run along with issues on his own, which is exactly what he does do, with an abundance of courage, tenacity and brazen tactics in late 1899 and into the new decade and new century. With the near destruction of the union movement at the beginning of the 1890s fresh in the minds of working men and women, when major strikes were crushed by ruthless employers backed by police, Billy Hughes, acting pretty much alone and utilising his mastery of the political strategies he had gleaned over the previous 10 years, rejuvenated key branches of the ailing union movement. Where others had failed before him, he systematically rebuilt, as I mentioned, the Wharf Labourers Union as its secretary, and soon after took on the presidency of the Trolley, Drayman and Carters Union. At mass union rallies, his electric speeches gained him a cult following. Intentionally distancing himself from the left wing of the Labor Party, he became the Mr. Fix-It of the industrial arena, according to Geoffrey Bolton, exhibiting quote, a skill unmatched in the Labor movement until the heyday of Bob Hawke at the ACTU. In the Commonwealth sphere throughout the first Federation decade, Hughes matched wits with two of Australia's finest parliamentary performers, protectionist Liberal leader Alfred Deakin and free trader George Reid. If Deakin's words had the subtle test of the dagger shrouded in velvet, and Reid's style was conspicuous for its clear argument and off-the-cuff humour, then Billy Hughes, their newly forged adversary, brandished an outsized razor-edged cutlass. Opponents feared his attacks, and if Deakin had got used to mesmerising the federal parliament with his eloquence in its first 8 years, it is certain that this dominance, this aura of invincibility, fell apart over two extraordinary days in the federal parliament, the 27th and 28th of May 1909, under a withering attack from Hughes. To recap very briefly, in 1904, Deakin had been directly, if covertly, responsible for the sinking of the Labor-Watson government, Labor's first, of course, but the end had been expected. In 1909, however, the circumstances had changed completely. Joseph Cook, long regarded as the first Labor rat, was by 1909 the scheming leader of the Free Traders during the term of the first Andrew Fisher Labor government. As Deakin slipped into dementia, unknown to anyone in the Parliament and his own family, Cook was a constant irritant in his ear, urging him to lead a fusion party of free traders and Liberals to extinguish the upstart Fisher government. Deakin reluctantly agreed, despite his realisation that he had joined the camp of almost everyone he had ever opposed in the Parliament since Federation. When the coup de grace occurred, this time round, Labor members were beside themselves with rage and bent on retaliation. Hughes was the unanimous choice to use his own description, to bell the cat on the floor of the Parliament. He was off the leash, producing an attack on Deakin that is still among the most often quoted Australian political speeches. Deakin's character and his lofty reputation for ethical behaviour and fair play were the target, and on the 27th of May, the assault began. Said Hughes, "There is not a vested interest in the country now that does not acclaim Alfred Deakin as their champion. He has persuaded those who call themselves Democrats to go over to the reactionaries. He has persuaded the reactionaries for the time being to cover their vulpine faces with the wool of the sheep. But the people, when they have an opportunity, will tear that cover off them and disclose them as they really are." Hughes was only warming up for a merciless speech on day 2. As he put it in one part of a long speech, "Last night, the honourable member, Alfred Deakin, abandoned the finer resources of political assassination and resorted to the bludgeon of the cannibal. Having perhaps exhausted all the finer possibilities of the art, he came out and bludgeoned us in the open light of day. It was then," says Hughes, "that I heard someone mention Judas. I do not agree with that," said Hughes. "It is not fair to Judas, for whom there is this to be said, that he did not gag the man whom he betrayed, nor did he fail to hang himself afterwards." When Hughes went to London as Australian Prime Minister 7 years later, and only a few months after taking over as leader, he had in his sights the British Prime Minister, hapless Herbert Asquith. Hughes blamed him for the Gallipoli debacle and insipid leadership in a series of fiery speeches around Britain that played a part in Asquith's resignation in December 1916, and Hughes' elevation to celebrity status, strongly supported by the full force of Lord Northcliffe's newspaper empire, the Daily Mirror, Daily Mail and the prestigious Times. Hughes basked in the adulation accorded him, which came with honourable doctorates and the keys to various cities. Immersed in unceasing turbulence throughout the second decade of the new century, how did Billy Hughes handle the pressures? What impact did it have on his private life? His demeanour, personality, health, relationships? How did it affect those around him? He was always forever cunning and ambitious, his Celtic temperament revelling in any atmosphere of excitement and intensity. Indeed, conflict, he once wrote, was the very breath of existence. Jim Banks, creator of the famed Ginger Meg's cartoon character, told Billy once that Megsy was the lineal successor to you. Hughes' explosions of anger intensified in the war years, something perhaps in part due to his chronic dyspepsia, which on occasion disabled him completely. His stomach was always on strike. That's not my phrase, that's Ross McMullen's, it's a goodie. His stomach was always on strike, and he lived with severe back pain, for which he later hired a full-time masseur. And thrown into the mix, his medically confirmed colon stasis, congestion of the appendix, spinal arthritis, chronic perineuritis, and cholesterolemia. I'm feeling good now. What, we might ask, didn't he have to deal with? And yet he managed, and in the war years lived off conflict. He had a constant battle to keep his outsized ego in check, that is, unless the public spotlight beckoned. Both Andrew Fisher, when High Commissioner in London, and Joseph Cook, when Hughes Deputy in London, were effectively vaporised by Billy when all three were there. On one occasion, during that very same 1919 trip, in a fit of pique, he even accused his wife Mary, the lady married, more of that in a moment, of stealing his thunder. When Hughes died, the Sunday Herald pondered, in their words, how much greater he would have been as a statesman if he had not suffered from the defects of his dazzling qualities. It was standard procedure for Hughes to ignore the feelings of others, treat staff as figurines to be shifted on a whim, and he routinely talked down to people. The one person who got under his skin was brilliant bulletin cartoonist David Lowe. For him, Hughes was the gift who kept on giving. Lowe found him irresistible, especially in the Great War, during which he published his Billy Book, a selection of political cartoons of Hughes' adventures in Britain. It was a huge bestseller in both hemispheres. The Australian soldiers loved it, but not Hughes himself, apparently. When one of his ministers presented him with the Billy Book, he ripped it up and chucked it in the bin. Billy Hughes' private life, to some extent, if we can say it, his inner man, is effectively exposed to us in his relationships with the women and children in his life. Let's start with Elizabeth Cutts, the partner who bore him 6 children and whom he never married. She loved her Will, as she called him, and it is clear her feelings were not reciprocated. Their oldest child, I'll say a bit about her, Ethel, sharp and opinionated, in later life remembered an incident when she was 12. At the suggestion of one of her female friends, her mother offered to assist Billy with his political work. Billy responded by asking young Ethel to head to the woodshed and get a tomahawk, adding that if the same interfering woman visits your mother again, you take that tomahawk and hit her on the head with it. Hughes ensured that the worlds he and Elizabeth inhabited were strictly separated, and since he was away so often in their 20-year relationship on parliamentary or union business, she brought up the kids on her own. She died far too young of heart failure, but not before writing a poignant last letter to Billy, dated the 14th of August, 1906. Dear Will, received cheques all right. Sorry you lost the case. Hope it will not put you out much. It is very cold here. I feel it dreadfully, for you see my heart is troubling me so. Makes my blood thin, for indeed I look very blue sometimes. The drought is still with us, and eatables seem to get dearer every day. Mrs. Williams bought Ethel a nice piece of music. She is so capable. Takes this gift from her pa, I suppose. What do you think? Good night, Will. Always remember this, that once I loved you very dearly, and though we may drift apart in the future, I shall always remain your faithful wife. And she signed it, E. Hughes. Elizabeth died a few days later. 5 years on, Billy married Mary Campbell, a grazier's daughter. Biographer Laurie Fitzharding writes that Mary provided a perfect domestic background for Billy, but subsequent research by Diane Langmore in her insightful study Prime Ministers' Wives has shown otherwise. Mary got used to being the butt of unfair jokes at her expense about her being vague and unintelligent. It was reported that federal public servant Sir Robert Garran used to pull her leg unmercifully, while Melbourne Punch gossiped that she, in their words, was scared to open her mouth for fear that Billy would put a foot in it. Mary struggled to cope with the number of stepchildren in her new home, especially teenage Ethel. Mutual resentment arose, and over time Billy accepted and contributed to his children with Elizabeth being kept at a distance, emotionally and geographically. The situation for them worsened with the birth in 1915 of Mary's only child, Helen. When Helen was 1 year old, she and her mother accompanied Hughes to London, Mary bursting with starstruck pride that her daughter's two godmothers were Lady Novar and Lady Northcote, both wives of Governors General. Helen grew up bright, creative, articulate and spoiled rotten by mum and dad. Life was very different for her half-brothers and her sisters. They did it far tougher. My research assistant, and she's in the audience, Barb, somewhere here, Barbara Coe, the wonderful Barbara Coe, has for some weeks been poring over newspapers and archival papers, gathering a treasure trove of Hughes' family secrets, and I know that she's got to publish sometime very soon. This morning, I can only supply a few glimpses of this darker side of Hughes' life. His oldest daughter, Ethel, bravely took on her father on behalf of her younger siblings after learning of their illegitimacy in the early 1920s, accusing him in writing of cruel and hard treatment, behaviour that has killed any feeling that we did have for you. She called her father a diabolical hypocrite, a black-hearted villain, and said, "What would people think of you if they knew you as you really are?" Billy made sure he took the steps necessary to keep his first family out of the newspapers, supporting them with schooling and living expenses, though never enough to live comfortably. Some of the things he said to each of the children at different times are truly awful, disparaging, dismissive, and at times downright cruel. Fourth child Ernest, known as Bill, went his own way. A soldier in the Great War awarded a military medal for gallantry in the field in France in 1917. He married in 1925 and had 5 kids. The family struggled in the Depression, prompting Bill to ask his father for a loan and a recommendation that might get him work in Canberra. Father loaned him some money, charged interest, and he did get his son a job as a road worker. The Canberra years radicalised Bill. Having supported his father's policies during the war, in Canberra in the 1930s, he joined the AWU, the Australian Workers' Union, becoming president of the local branch and later vice president of the ALP in the Territory. Bill Hughes and his unionist mates kept constant pressure on the United Australia government and its Attorney-General of the time, Robert Menzies, throughout the Depression decade. That's an amazing story, which I've written about independently. Menzies hated it. His party colleague, Billy Hughes, never a Menzies admirer, was probably bemused. He had, of course, on one occasion declared that Bob Menzies couldn't lead a flock of homing pigeons. Bill was particularly fond of his half-sister Helen, able to enjoy vicariously her continent-hopping childhood with her doting parents. When Helen headed off aged 21 in 1937 on her 5th trip to the UK, he was happy for her. In London, she attended the coronation of George VI and was presented at court. Indeed, with her model look, she was literally a model, and vivacious personality, she was a popular guest at a number of flash society functions that year. But she was also pregnant, unknown to her parents and family. On the 9th of August, she died in childbirth. With British and Australian newspapers reporting that the cause was a perforated ulcer, her body was sent back to Sydney for a burial service attended by many government representatives, the judiciary, etc. It was later rumoured in the tabloids that she died having an abortion, and later still that she died in childbirth, the assumption being that the child died along with its mother. He didn't. Financially supported in his youth through a confidential codicil, Hughes added to his will that Barb's been doing work on. David Evan Hughes became David Duffy. That's a story I can't go into. And many years later, back to David Hughes once more. He died 2 years ago, in 2022, having lived a full and very private life. A self-confessed political animal who chose not to go into politics, he never married, lived his later years in the Blue Mountains, was an active member of the Humanist Society, and when he died a couple of years ago, as I said, a fellow member described him as a lover of books, and a man of mystery indeed. What conclusions do we reach about the political career of David Hughes' grandfather, Billy, Anzac's little digger? On one side of the ledger, the breadth of his achievements, there are a number of utterly worthy entries. His resilience and resolve when he took Labor's message to the bush in the early 1890s with, as he put it, white-hot enthusiasm. The life-changing legislation he helped to write and navigate through the New South Wales Colonial Parliament in the late 1890s. His single-handed, pretty much, revival of the union movement in Australia. His understanding of the zeitgeist at the time of Federation and its implications for an independent Australian defence capability in the near future. His robust advocacy of Australian interests in the Great War and at the Versailles Peace Conference post-war as the first Australian politician to have a genuine impact on the world stage, and his post-war government's establishment in 1920 of an Institute of Science and Industry, forerunner to CSIRO, and a Department of Civil Aviation, and also actually the sort of forerunner to the Productivity Commission. By force of will, intelligence, personality and cunning, Billy Hughes had the knack of making things happen. This same talent, of course, could and did work against him, those around him and the country he led. His most pernicious behaviour clustered around, and some of his most brilliant behaviour, clustered around the years 1916 to 1921. Years when he pursued an unprincipled, divisive sectarian agenda through the muscle of government edict and policy, an agenda from which it took the Australian community fully 2 generations to recover from. The War Precautions Act, an enemy alien legislation that made Hughes more jailer than orator, especially in the early part of the war. His cowed wartime administrations that undermine any semblance of social, cultural and moral cohesion at an incredibly difficult time. And his entrenched stance on Germany at the Versailles Conference, which, as one parliamentarian wrote in 1919, who had no great opinion of Hughes, will set in, this is 1919 he's writing this, will set in train another war because Hughes, Billy Hughes, insisted on tearing Germany to pieces and throwing the fragments to the dogs, end quote. Well, history, of course, confirmed, and Hughes wasn't alone in doubling down on Germany with the results that we know. In the final instance, Hughes resists a conclusive assessment. Only a few years after 50,000 British women signed a petition demanding that Hughes be offered a seat in the House of Commons, he was removed, he was removed as Prime Minister in his own country. Usually the beginning of the end for any outgoing PM, he stayed in Parliament for another 3 decades, virtually to the end of his life, feeling he could be drafted one more time into the nation's top job. Right to the end of the 1940s, he's still thinking that way. In the preface of his last volume of political writings, the entertaining memoir Policies and Potentates, published in 1950, in typical fashion he boasted about the political giants of yesteryear with whom he had crossed swords in hot debate. And yet, when you read it, one senses a wistful tone throughout in his voice. Biographer Don Whittington, the Managing Director of Australian Press Services, who perhaps understood Hughes as much as anybody in his sunset years, portrayed him at the end as, in Whittington's words, a pathetic figure, deaf, bent, grey, a lonely figure in Parliament House, talking with journalists who at least paid lip service to his former eminence and chuckled at his jokes. Lifelong bravado was absent when Billy penned his very last diary entry. He fell back on a reliable St Stephen's School source of old, William Shakespeare, and quoted him. "What a piece of work is man, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust?" End quote. Who knows? Perhaps Hughes found Hamlet's timeless soliloquy a fitting epitaph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dave. We do have a microphone, so if we have any questions from the audience. Questions for Dave? Yes, we have one over here, Joe.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, David, for that rich and engaging inquiry into Hughes's life. You mentioned towards the end his implacable hostility to Germany in the aftermath of the war. I was wondering if you'd shift the focus for us towards Turkey, because I know how obsessed Hughes was with retaining all of the Anzac area at Gallipoli for Australia and New Zealand, actually wresting that from the control of the Ottoman Empire. Does that figure in the book at all?
Certainly it figures for him, as we know, Bruce, most definitely. I'd have to say, and to be absolutely honest, I haven't gone into great depth at this point, of course, short of writing the monograph, when there'll be a lot more happening at that point. It is interesting that Hughes, as we know, was such a significant figure at the Versailles Peace Conference and scheming basically, of course, for Australian interests. Well, not basically, entirely for Australian interests. So much so that the kind of the gravitas and the points that had been raised amongst a number of the leaders, for example, Clemenceau, as we know, admire as distinct from Woodrow Wilson, that Hughes pursues it hard, and he is in fact, determined in his approach to life post-war to do the best for Australia. As simple as that. He looks mostly, in my reading, to the Pacific, of course, and particularly New Guinea, but nevertheless was looking at, and was indeed a genuine participant in the world discussion of life after the Great War. More.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Is the book finished?
No, my book?
Yeah.
No, indeed not started.
Okay.
It is just to fill people in. They're looking at their PMs here. I'll bring you up to date. That's a good question. I'm very happy for that question. So 4 are done, and you can, and I'm sure some of you have got some of them. 4 are done, and you can get them at the National Archives, in the Parliamentary Bookshop, etc. The first 4. Because of, and I'm blaming COVID, I shouldn't really, but I'll blame COVID and say that Prime Minister number 6, about whom I've lectured here and in England, that is to say Joseph Cook, will be out, as Stephen mentioned, and launched by, we hope, the presiding officers probably in February of next year, so not too far away. And the one that I've got to finish now, who I lectured on all of about 2 or 3 years ago, is Andrew Fisher, Prime Minister number 5. Now, let me say that the aim is that Andrew Fisher, coming out fairly quickly, because he's almost finished, will come out, and that will have 6. At which case, to finally answer the question, number 7, and I will give the Hughes lecture in London late in the year, what we're aiming for, and Steve and I have talked about it, what we're aiming for is the Hughes monograph, number 7, coming out in the second half of 2025, which only leaves Bruce. And he'll be different for a whole range of reasons, but nevertheless we'll get to Bruce so that we're dealing with the person who was Prime Minister when the Parliament moved from Melbourne, of course, to Canberra.
I've got an interest in the events at Warwick in 1917 with the egg throwing, stuff that created the first national police force that was devoted primarily to Queensland, events in Queensland.
Indeed.
Does that feature in your book at all? Because
it will definitely, and apart from anything else, the most wonderful cartoon. Yeah. And it's not David Lowe, I don't think. It's a beauty where the egg's splattering all over Hughes. But those who don't know, what we're talking about here is a most, once again, an extraordinary moment when Hughes in 1917 was in Warwick in country Queensland, and a couple of the unionists who were not happy with him at all threw eggs.
They were actually young Irish guys. Yeah,
they were. And 2 things about that. One is that on the back of it, Hughes immediately begins what becomes the Australian Federal Police. But also, as I read only just recently, and you might have yourself, the very person who threw the egg that hit became a good friend of Billy Hughes late in life.
I didn't know that. But the Queensland Police Sergeant was of Irish extraction. He refused to deal with it, saying it wasn't a Queensland matter, it wasn't a Queensland crime.
Yeah, yeah.
So that
And Ryan was the Premier. You know, it was very much a sort of, you know, a breakdown, but, you know, on pretty much, well, you'd say sectarian lines, really. Two questions there, which we'll get to. Three questions?
Thank you so much. Just a quick one.
And I'll try and be quick in the answer too.
Fellow Welshman Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, offered Billy Hughes a peerage in the House of Lords. At the time he said, it'll be the ruin of me, and he rejected it. He went on to accept a Companion of Honour award in Imperial. Any further context about that situation?
No, other than it was their relationship, which again I haven't gone into in any deeper detail, but as we know, when Hughes does his thing in 1916 backed by Lord Northcliffe, and he is indeed a celebrity wherever he goes, David Lloyd George is thrilled with what's happening to Asquith, and in fact takes over as we know Prime Minister shortly, you know, at the beginning of 17, isn't it? The beginning of 17. They are effectively allies for maybe the next, 18 and into 19. But by the time it's post-Versailles peace conference, Lloyd George's enormous enthusiasm for Hughes has waned. Of course, that relationship, I can say, given that I mentioned David Lowe, the most famous David Lowe cartoon, and it's brilliant and it will certainly be in the monograph, has Asquith and Lloyd George at one end of a long table and Hughes going berserk down the other end of the long table, and Asquith is tapping Lloyd George, who of course was Welsh, and saying, talk to him in Welsh, David, try and settle him down. It's absolutely fantastic. In fact, I think I've got a feeling the original of that is in the National Library, or possibly even in the Parliament, but it'll certainly be in the monograph. Greg, no, coming up. Sorry, yes.
Is there any truth in the fact that Hughes tried to keep Monash in England after the end of the war because he feared the possibility of Monash going for Parliament?
I haven't read that. Bruce might be a person who could. Bruce Gates, whether you can answer that, I don't know. I can't answer it. I can't. I haven't got through. Do you have an answer, Bruce, to that? I'm not sure. Yeah, sorry about that. Haven't got there. Greg.
David, just a wonderful talk. But
thank you.
I kept waiting for one word: conscription.
Of course, it will be dealt with considerably in the monograph. And the thing with conscription and a 50-minute talk in the Parliament, when you want to try and actually cover off on Hughes, is that you can't go in any way into any sort of depth. If I can say it so quickly, and those of you, most of you in the audience would be aware in some way or other about the conscription referenda. So Hughes, the issue that basically changes things are the two conscription referenda, both of which end in no votes, fairly narrow in the first, slightly bigger in the second. The first of them in October 1916, at which point Hughes, a little bit going into the early part of 17, in a meeting of the ALP caucus, basically splits it, walks out, 24 members follow him. That's the beginning of the alteration to Australian politics for, decades to come. Hughes, not to be put off, goes even more rapidly at the second conscription referendum in December of 1917, loses again, having been reliably told by his informants that the soldiers were going to vote for it. They did not on the front for the conscription referendum. In the second one particularly, Archbishop Daniel Mannix takes Hughes on, so you've got these two colossus figures that are at one another's throats. Mannix, I've seen some actual footage, and some of you might have seen it, of a demonstration, basically a sort of pro-Catholic demonstration backing Mannix, I think in 1920 in Melbourne, and there were estimated to be 100,000 people, if I'm not wrong. There's 100,000 people there. So the nation goes into a complete, what I will certainly be dealing with in some detail in the monograph, the altered nation. We are a completely changed nation, and that becomes to me even more sad a thing because of that period from 1905 to, say, 1913, when Australia is being viewed as the social laboratory of the world, on the back of the Deakin 3 years in his long period in government, and likewise with Fisher. So Australia, there was something so optimistic, unless, of course, you happen to have coloured skin when your experience is of an entirely different nature. But you have that happening. So it's a critical moment that changes the game, changes Hughes' lives and changes the lives of those around him. Sorry, I couldn't get to it, Greg. I absolutely couldn't have done it and dealt with the rest of the life. Any last question? Terry.
David, you mentioned the relationship between Andrew Fisher and Billy Hughes. Fisher had espoused a particularly authentic nationalism for Australia. Hughes would seem to be simply an empire nationalism. Is that a fair description? How would you describe it?
It's absolutely fair and accurate. Hughes was never particularly interested in that, and Justice and you and I have talked about this, and certainly I'm writing about it on Fisher pretty much as we speak, and that is that Fisher was very interested in the nation-making enterprise, which might go to making sure on stamps you put a kangaroo in the middle of Australia rather than the king. And when Cook gets in for his brief time, he changes it back again. But that sort of thing. His great love of Fisher's love, as we both know, of Wattle, so that in fact it becomes very much a part of, first of all, his papers and notebooks and Christmas cards. And they're only small things, but if you want to go to the larger things, you've got things like Fisher making sure that he buys the Petherick collection. We all know about the Petherick collection of the National Library. He starts the Historical Memorials Committee. That's what you've got happening. With Hughes, nothing of the kind. He's not an empire loyalist until the Great War, pretty much the back end of the Great War, because even early 1915 and into 16, he's still very critical of the British generals. But that softens. It softens to nothing. In fact, it's one of the things I had to cut out of the paper. It's one of the things in the last point of the war, he really has acquiesced. Perhaps, if Al Grasby was here or King O'Malley, they'd say that he got Duchessed in England. He was indeed Duchessed in England. So that he is changed. But he's also changed by the massive popularity, the awards, etc., so that he is in fact an empire loyalist, which is actually fits fairly tightly with Australia post the Great War for the period that follows. Any last questions? Okay.
Thank you very much, Dave. Thanks again. Please thank Dave Headon. As Dave mentioned, you can get the first 4 monographs in the Parliament House shop downstairs on your way out. Excellent Christmas presents, I should say. We're looking forward to the cookbook and future publications. And
I might say my first cookbook.
And it just leads me to say all the best for the festive season, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2025. Thank you.